Immediately following Britannic's loss, theories abounded as to what had happened. The German government countered that the British ship was illegally carrying munitions in violation of international law. The British countered that a German U-boat, despite it being marked as a hospital ship, had fired in broad daylight, sending doctors and nurses to their doom. Our expedition has a singular goal: to answer the question, why did this ship, with all of its additional safety features, sink 3 times faster than her more famous sister, Titanic?
Something massive is sitting on the bottom of the Aegean Sea, and when Jacques Cousteau found it in 1975, he uncovered a story that makes the Titanic disaster look like just the beginning. This is the HMHS Britannic, Titanic's bigger, supposedly safer sister ship that was designed to never sink. But here's what nobody talks about. There was a woman on board who had already survived the Titanic, and what happened to her next will blow your mind. Most people have never heard of the Britannic, but they should have. She was actually bigger than the Titanic, and I mean significantly bigger. We're talking about a ship that was 881 feet long compared to Titanic's 852 feet, but size wasn't the only difference. After her sister ship went down in 1912, the shipbuilders at Harland & Wolff in Belfast went absolutely crazy with safety features. They installed a double hull system that was supposed to prevent any single breach from sinking the ship. They raised the watertight bulkheads higher, so even if multiple compartments flooded, the water couldn't spill over into adjacent sections. They added way more lifeboats, enough for everyone on board plus some. They even installed a more sophisticated wireless system and better emergency lighting. This thing was supposed to be actually unsinkable, not just marketing nonsense like they'd used for the Titanic. But here's where the story gets really weird. The Britannic never even got to be a passenger ship. She was launched in 1914, right as World War I was breaking out. The British Admiralty took one look at this magnificent vessel and said, "We need that." They requisitioned her before she could make a single commercial voyage and converted her into a floating hospital. Picture this for a second. You've got the most luxurious ocean liner of its time. We're talking about grand staircases, crystal chandeliers, first-class dining rooms that could seat hundreds of people in absolute opulence. And suddenly it's all being ripped out and replaced with hospital beds, operating theaters, and medical equipment. The ship that was meant to carry wealthy passengers on leisurely Atlantic crossings was now going to carry wounded soldiers from the brutal battlefields of World War I. But there was something about this particular voyage in November 1916 that nobody saw coming, something that involved a decision some nurses made that accidentally turned a manageable emergency into a complete catastrophe. And the woman who witnessed it all? She had already lived through what should have been impossible, because if anyone knew what was about to happen, it should have been her. Her name was Violet Jessop, and by 1916, she had already lived through what should have been impossible. Let me paint you a picture of this woman's life, because it reads like something out of a nightmare. In 1911, Violet was working as a stewardess on the RMS Olympic, the first of the 3 Olympic-class ships. She was just going about her normal duties when the ship collided with HMS Hawke, a British warship. The Olympic's hull was damaged, propeller shaft was bent, and they had to limp back to port. Violet survived that one, but you'd think she might consider a career change, right? Wrong. In 1912, she took a job as a stewardess on the Titanic. Yeah, that Titanic. She was on the maiden voyage, the one that everyone knows about. When the ship hit the iceberg, Violet was ordered into Lifeboat 16. She spent hours floating in the freezing North Atlantic, watching the most famous ship in the world disappear beneath the waves. Over 1,500 people died that night. Violet was not one of them. Now here she was in 1916, working as a nurse on the Britannic. You'd think she might be a little nervous about getting on another White Star Line ship, but Violet needed the work. Plus, this was different. This was a hospital ship, protected under international law. They had huge red crosses painted on the sides. The mission was purely humanitarian. They were going to pick up wounded soldiers from the Dardanelles campaign and bring them back to England for treatment. Violet even wrote in her memoirs about how peaceful this voyage felt compared to her previous experiences. The weather was good, the sea was calm, and they were doing God's work, as she put it. She was surrounded by trained medical personnel. The ship had all the latest safety features, and they were following a route that had been used dozens of times without incident. The irony is almost cruel when you think about it. Here's a woman who had already survived 2 major maritime disasters, finally feeling safe again, surrounded by people whose job it was to save lives. But someone had laid a trap in the water, and there was a small decision some of her fellow nurses were about to make that would turn a minor explosion into a race against time. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because what happened at 8:12 a.m. that morning started with a sound that Violet said she'd never forget. See, this wasn't just about one unlucky woman. Although Violet's story is incredible on its own, the Britannic represented something much bigger. It was supposed to prove that humanity had learned from the Titanic disaster. Think about it. All those safety improvements, all that careful planning, all those lessons written in blood and ice water. This ship was the physical embodiment of the idea that we could engineer our way out of tragedy. Plus, this was wartime, and ships like the Britannic were supposed to be protected under the Hague Convention. They weren't just civilian vessels, they were mercy ships, carrying wounded soldiers and medical personnel, not weapons or ammunition. In theory, nobody was supposed to attack them. The red crosses painted on their sides weren't just decoration. They were supposed to be shields that would protect them from the horrors of war. But the Germans had been laying mines throughout the Aegean Sea as part of their strategy to disrupt Allied shipping routes. These weren't targeted attacks on hospital ships. They were area denial weapons, scattered throughout the water like deadly seeds, waiting for any ship unlucky enough to find them. On November 21, 1916, the Britannic was about to find one of them. What makes this story so haunting is that it wasn't even a direct attack. It was just bad luck meeting bad decisions. And those bad decisions, they came from some of the most caring, dedicated people on the ship. Nurses who were just trying to get fresh air for their patients. A captain who was trying to save his ship by doing exactly what his training told him would work. Medical officers who were following protocols that made perfect sense in normal circumstances. But there's something about disasters at sea that turns good decisions into fatal mistakes, and kindness into catastrophe. Sometimes the things you do to help just make everything worse. And when that explosion hit. Now, here's what's really disturbing about what happened next. The Britannic had been specifically designed to survive this exact kind of damage. The mine blast should have been manageable. The ship should have stayed afloat long enough for an organized evacuation. But a simple act of kindness, something that any caring nurse would do, was about to turn a manageable emergency into a complete catastrophe. At 8:12 a.m. on November 21, 1916, Violet Jessup was probably getting ready for her morning duties when the mine exploded against the ship's starboard bow. She later described it as a dull, deafening roar that seemed to come from deep inside the ship, followed by a shuddering that ran through the entire vessel like an earthquake. But here's the thing that most people don't understand about the Britannic disaster. The explosion itself wasn't what doomed the ship. Let me explain what actually happened, because it's way more complex and tragic than just ship hits mine, ship sinks. The blast hole was significant, sure, but it was manageable. The mine had exploded against the ship's starboard side, near the bow, opening up a gash in the hull. But remember all those safety improvements I mentioned. They were working exactly as designed. The ship's improved watertight bulkheads were holding. Water was flooding into the forward compartments, yes, but slowly enough that the pumps could handle it, at least initially. Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett, they called him Iceberg Charlie because of his reputation for cautious navigation, immediately sprang into action. He ordered the watertight doors closed throughout the ship, which sealed off the damaged sections. He called for damage reports from all departments. He even started turning the ship toward the nearest land, the Greek island of Kea, which was just a few miles away. His plan was simple and sound. Beach the ship in shallow water before she could sink. Drive her up onto the shore if necessary. The Britannic was still making way. Her engines were still running, and they had enough time to reach safety if they moved quickly. It should have worked. The engineering was solid. The crew was well trained, and they had learned all the right lessons from the Titanic disaster. But nobody had counted on human compassion becoming the enemy, because while Captain Bartlett was fighting to save his ship, and while the engineering crew was managing the flooding, some of the nurses were making a decision that seemed not just reasonable, but medically necessary. They opened the portholes, and that's when everything went to hell. The nurses had opened portholes throughout the ship to get fresh air circulating for their patients. Now, before you judge them for this, you need to understand the context. These were trained medical professionals dealing with wounded soldiers in what was essentially a floating hospital. Proper ventilation wasn't just about comfort. It was about preventing infection, reducing fever, and maintaining basic sanitary conditions for their patients. In normal circumstances, this would have been not just acceptable, but required medical practice. Keep the air moving, keep the patients comfortable, prevent the spread of disease in the closed quarters of a ship. Any good nurse would have done the same thing. Hell, it was probably in their training manual. But these weren't normal circumstances. The ship was listing to starboard because of the mine damage, which meant that every single one of those open portholes on the starboard side was now below the waterline or rapidly approaching it. What started as a controlled flood from the mine damage suddenly became an unstoppable torrent from dozens of new entry points. Water was now rushing in through portholes on multiple decks. The careful calculations that the engineering crew had made about pumping capacity and flooding rates, they went out the window. The watertight compartments that were supposed to contain the damage, they couldn't handle the volume of water coming in from so many different sources. Captain Bartlett tried everything he could think of. He kept the engines running at full speed, trying to drive the ship onto the beach before she could sink. But the faster the ship moved through the water, the more pressure there was on those open portholes, and the more water poured in. It was like trying to save a sinking boat by rowing faster. The cure was making the disease worse. Meanwhile, Violet Jessup was watching this unfold from inside the ship. She later wrote that she could see the water rising with frightening rapidity through the corridors. Wounded soldiers who couldn't move were being carried to higher decks by nurses and orderlies. Medical equipment was being abandoned as entire sections of the ship became uninhabitable. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, that had been designed with every lesson from the Titanic disaster built into her bones, was going down in less than an hour. And that's when the real horror began, because the propellers were still spinning when they started launching the lifeboats. And some of those lifeboats were about to go straight into the spinning blades. This is the part of the story that absolutely haunts me, because it shows how disaster can cascade from one bad decision to another until you end up with something unthinkable. Remember, Captain Bartlett was still trying to save the ship by driving it toward shore. That meant the engines were running at full power, which meant those massive propellers at the stern were churning the water at high speed. But the ship was also listing heavily to starboard and sinking by the bow, which meant that launching lifeboats was becoming increasingly urgent. 2 lifeboats full of people were launched from the starboard side, while the ship's propellers were still running. The physics of what happened next are as inevitable as they are horrifying. The lifeboats, once they hit the water, were immediately caught in the powerful suction created by the spinning propellers. They were drawn toward the stern of the ship like debris caught in a whirlpool. The people in those boats would have seen what was happening. They would have tried to row away from the ship, but small wooden lifeboats are no match for the hydrodynamic forces created by massive propellers. They were pulled directly into the spinning blades and completely destroyed. Most of the 30 people who died in the Britannic disaster weren't killed by the mine explosion. They weren't killed by drowning when the ship went down. They were killed by the ship's own propellers, trying to escape a sinking vessel that was still fighting for its life. Can you imagine being in that lifeboat? You've survived a mine explosion. You've made it through the chaos of abandoning ship. You think you're safe, and then you see those massive metal blades spinning toward you through the water. There's nothing you can do. You can't outrun them. You can't fight them. You can only watch them come. But here's what gets me about this whole thing. Every single decision that led to this moment made perfect sense in isolation. The nurses opened portholes to help their patients breathe better. The captain kept the engines running to try to save the ship. The lifeboat crews were trying to get people to safety as quickly as possible. Every single person involved was trying to do the right thing, trying to save lives. But when you put all those individual decisions together in an emergency situation, when you add the pressure of time and the fog of crisis, they combined into something deadly. It's like a perfect storm of good intentions that created a disaster worse than the original problem. That's when Violet Jessup made a decision that probably saved her life. Again, what Violet did next shows you something about survival that most people never learn. She had been through this before, twice, and she knew something that the other passengers didn't. Something about human psychology under extreme stress. Something about the difference between following the crowd and thinking for yourself. Something that might be the difference between life and death. While chaos was erupting around her, while people were screaming and running for the lifeboats, while the ship's deck was tilting at an increasingly dangerous angle, Violet Jessup did something that sounds almost absurd when you first hear it. She went back to her cabin to get her toothbrush. Now, this wasn't about dental hygiene. This was about survival psychology, about the kind of hard-earned wisdom that you only get from living through the impossible multiple times. Violet had learned from the Titanic that when you're abandoning ship, when your world is literally falling apart around you. You need something to anchor your mind to, something small and familiar to hold on to, something that gives your brain a focus point when everything else is chaos. The toothbrush became her talisman, her psychological anchor. It was proof that she intended to survive, that she was planning for a future beyond the next few minutes. It sounds crazy, but there's actually solid psychology behind this. In extreme stress situations, having a small, manageable task to focus on can keep your mind from shutting down completely. But Violet had learned something else from her previous experiences. Don't trust the lifeboats completely. She had seen what happened when too many people tried to get into too few boats. She had watched people fight and panic and make decisions based on fear rather than logic. And now, watching the chaos on deck and seeing those first lifeboats being launched, she made a calculated decision. She wasn't going to wait for an organized evacuation. She wasn't going to stand in line and hope that there would be room for her in a boat. When the ship started its final plunge, when the deck became too steep to stand on, Violet Jessup jumped. She leaped straight into the Aegean Sea and started swimming away from the ship as fast as she could. This decision probably saved her life, because it meant she missed the entire lifeboat disaster with the propellers. While other people were being pulled into those spinning blades, Violet was already in the water, swimming clear of the ship's death throes. But here's what's really remarkable about this moment. As she's floating in the water, watching this massive ship rear up like a dying whale and disappear beneath the waves, Violet later wrote that she felt almost calm, like she had been here before, like she knew how this story was going to end, because she had already lived through the opening chapters. Because this was now the third time in 5 years that Violet had survived a major ship disaster, and people started to wonder. After the Britannic sinking, Violet Jessup became known in the press as Miss Unsinkable. The newspapers loved the story. Here was a woman who had survived the Olympic collision, the Titanic sinking, and the Britannic explosion. 3 disasters, 3 different ships, 1 impossible survivor. It was the kind of human interest story that sells papers and captures imaginations. But what the newspapers didn't talk about, what they couldn't have known because Violet was too private to discuss it publicly at the time, was the psychological toll this was taking on her. She kept working on ships for decades after the Britannic disaster. She needed the income, and it was the only profession she knew. But she admitted in her memoirs, which weren't published until much later, that she never felt completely safe at sea again. Every unusual sound, every sudden movement of the ship, every change in the engine's rhythm would bring back memories of those 3 disasters. She would lie in her bunk at night, listening to the creaking of the hull and wondering if this would be the night when her luck finally ran out. She developed what we would probably recognize today as a form of PTSD, though they didn't have a name for it back then. And here's something that really bothers me about how people reacted to her story. Some people started treating her like she was cursed. They thought that maybe she was the common factor in all these accidents, that somehow her presence was bringing bad luck to the ship she sailed on. Imagine surviving 3 impossible disasters, 3 separate brushes with death, and then having people blame you for them. Some sailors are superstitious by nature, and the idea of a cursed passenger who brought bad luck to ships was the kind of thing that could spread quickly through the maritime community. Violet occasionally had trouble finding work because ship owners were afraid that hiring her would doom their vessels. But Violet kept going back to sea, kept working as a stewardess and nurse, because what else was she going to do? The sea was her livelihood, her profession, her life, and maybe in some weird way, she felt like she owed it something. Maybe she was trying to prove that she wasn't cursed, that she was just a woman doing her job who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, 3 times. Or maybe she was trying to understand something about fate and survival that the rest of us never have to confront. Maybe she kept going back because she needed to know whether her survival was luck, skill, or something else entirely. Because 60 years later, when Jacques Cousteau found the wreck, what he discovered down there was going to change everything we thought we knew about that disaster. Violet's story isn't really about luck or being cursed, although those are the easy explanations that people reach for when they can't understand how someone could survive the impossible. Her story is about what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances, not just once, but repeatedly. She represents something that I think we've lost touch with in modern society. The idea that resilience isn't just bouncing back from disaster once, it's choosing to keep going, even when disaster seems to follow you around. Think about what it takes to get back on a ship after surviving the Titanic. Most people would have said, That's it. I'm done with the ocean forever. But Violet went back. And then, after the Britannic, she went back again. For decades. That's not luck or coincidence. That's a conscious choice to refuse to let fear control your life. The Britannic's sinking was different from the Titanic in a crucial way. The Titanic disaster was, in part, about class distinctions and social inequality. The wealthy passengers had better access to lifeboats, better accommodations, better everything. But the Britannic was a hospital ship. Everyone on board, from Captain Bartlett to the nurses like Violet, to the wounded soldiers they were caring for, was there to help other people. This wasn't about privilege or social status. This was about human beings trying to do good in the world, and yet disaster still found them. That's a hard truth to swallow, isn't it? It suggests that sometimes, no matter how good your intentions are, no matter how much you've learned from past mistakes, no matter how carefully you plan and prepare, the world can still destroy you in ways you never saw coming. But Violet's response to that truth is what makes her remarkable. She didn't let the fear of disaster stop her from living her life. She didn't let other people's superstitions define her identity. She didn't retreat from the world or become paralyzed by the knowledge that terrible things could happen at any moment. She just kept going. She kept working, kept traveling, kept putting herself in situations where she might face danger, because the alternative, letting fear make her decisions, was worse than the risk. And I think there's something profound in that choice. Something that speaks to a kind of courage that goes beyond just surviving disaster. What they found down there was like a time capsule from 1916, frozen in the moment when everything went wrong. The wreck of the Britannic holds secrets that nobody expected to find. Things that change the whole story of what happened that day. Things that make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature and disaster and survival. And some of those secrets are still being discovered right now, more than 100 years later. When Jacques Cousteau found the Britannic in 1975, using side-scan sonar to locate the wreck on the floor of the Aegean Sea, he discovered something that nobody expected. The ship was in remarkable condition, unlike the Titanic, which had broken apart during its descent and scattered debris across miles of ocean floor. The Britannic had settled intact at 400 feet deep. You can still see her massive bulk lying on her starboard side, her superstructure perfectly preserved by the relatively shallow cold waters of the Aegean. The ship is so well preserved that you can make out individual portholes, deck railings, even some of the Red Cross markings that identified her as a hospital ship. It's like looking at a photograph from 1916, except the photograph is the size of a skyscraper lying on the ocean floor. But what's really eerie is what you can see inside the wreck. Cousteau's team, and the many diving expeditions that followed, have been able to penetrate deep into the ship's interior. And what they found there is like walking through a museum of the disaster, except everything is exactly where it was when the ship went down. The portholes that the nurses opened, the ones that turned a manageable flood into a catastrophic one, are still open. You can see them, circular black holes in the ship's side, still gaping after more than a century underwater. The watertight doors that Captain Bartlett ordered closed are still closed, massive steel barriers that held back the sea for as long as they could. Cousteau's team found medical equipment still in place, surgical instruments scattered across the floors of what had been operating theaters. They found beds still made up for patients who never arrived, their sheets and blankets long since dissolved by salt water, but the metal frames still arranged in neat rows like a hospital ward frozen in time. But the most haunting discovery was in the ship's interior corridors. You can still see the path that the flooding water took as it rushed through the ship. There are debris patterns that show exactly how the disaster unfolded, how the water found its way from the mine blast hole to the open portholes to the engine rooms. It's like reading the story of the sinking written in rust and sediment on the ocean floor. But the wreck also holds some darker secrets about what really happened that day. In recent years, as diving technology has improved and more teams have explored the wreck, they've been finding artifacts and evidence that tell us even more about the human side of this story. And some of what they've found is disturbing. In 2025, just recently, Greek divers working under the supervision of historian Simon Mills, who actually owns the wreck site, recovered the ship's bell from the Britannic. When they brought it to the surface, cleaned off decades of marine growth, the ship's name was still clearly visible, etched into the bronze like a message from the past. That bell is going to be displayed in a museum, so people can connect with this story in a tangible way, hold a piece of 1916 in their hands. But that bell also represents something else. It's evidence that we're still learning new things about this disaster more than a century later. Recent expeditions have found mine anchors on the seabed near the wreck, confirming that the ship was indeed sunk by a German mine, not torpedoed, as some conspiracy theories have suggested over the years. But they've also found something more troubling: evidence that some of the ship's safety systems didn't work the way they were supposed to. Watertight doors that should have sealed automatically when the flooding began were found standing open. Safety protocols that should have prevented the propeller incident were apparently ignored in the chaos of the evacuation. Multiple dive teams have explored the wreck over the decades. Robert Ballard, the same guy who found the Titanic, led an expedition in 1995. Technical divers using advanced mixed gas equipment have penetrated deep into the ship's interior, mapping corridors and compartments that haven't seen sunlight since 1916. What they've found suggests that the Britannic disaster wasn't just a case of bad luck. It was a perfect storm of human error, design flaws that nobody anticipated, and impossible circumstances that turned every good decision into a potential catastrophe. Some of the watertight doors were propped open by crew members trying to move equipment and wounded soldiers. Some of the safety equipment had been removed or relocated during the ship's conversion from passenger liner to hospital ship. The very modifications that were supposed to make the ship better at saving lives may have made it more vulnerable to sinking. Questions that make you wonder if we've really learned anything from these disasters at all. Here's what really bothers me about the Britannic story, what keeps me awake at night thinking about it. It shows us that having the best technology and the best intentions isn't enough to prevent disaster. The ship had every safety improvement that could be imagined after the Titanic. The crew was experienced and well-trained. The mission was purely humanitarian. They were saving lives, not taking them. And yet, when crisis hit, everything fell apart anyway. The nurse's compassionate decision to open portholes turned into a fatal mistake. The captain's brave attempt to save the ship led to the propeller disaster. The safety improvements that were supposed to prevent another Titanic actually created new ways for things to go wrong. Every single person involved was trying to do the right thing, and their collective efforts nearly destroyed them all. That's a lesson that applies to way more than just ships. In our modern world, we like to think that we can engineer our way out of any problem, that we can create systems and protocols that will prevent disasters from happening. We see it all the time. After every plane crash, every industrial accident, every technological failure, there's a rush to find the cause and fix it. New regulations, new safety equipment, new training procedures. And those improvements do help, don't get me wrong. The Britannic saved over 1,000 lives that day, compared to the 1,800 who died on the Titanic. The safety improvements worked, but the Britannic reminds us that human nature, both its best impulses and its fatal flaws, can override any system. The nurses who opened those portholes weren't being careless or stupid. They were being compassionate, following their medical training, trying to help their patients. But in the context of a sinking ship, compassion became a weapon turned against them. The captain who kept the engines running wasn't being reckless. He was following sound maritime practice, trying to save his ship and everyone on board. But those spinning propellers turned the evacuation into a slaughter. The crew members who propped open watertight doors weren't being negligent. They were trying to move wounded soldiers to safety, trying to get medical equipment where it was needed. But those open doors turned the ship's safety systems into a highway for the sea. This is the dark truth that the Britannic wreck whispers from the depths. Sometimes the very things we do to try to help can make things worse. Sometimes our best impulses can lead to our worst disasters. Sometimes there is no right answer, no perfect solution, no way to engineer our way out of the fundamental chaos of existence. Because in the end, what saved people wasn't the technology or the protocols. It was something much more basic. When you strip away all the technical details and the historical context and the engineering analyses, the Britannic story is really about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and somehow finding a way to survive. Not because they had the best equipment or the most advanced training, but because they refused to give up. Violet Jessup didn't survive 3 ship disasters because she was lucky or cursed or chosen by fate. She survived because she learned to think clearly under pressure, because she made hard decisions when everything around her was chaos, and because she never stopped believing that survival was possible. Even when the odds were impossible, even when logic said she should give up, she kept fighting. The Greek fishermen who pulled survivors out of the water didn't do it because of any international protocol or rescue manual. They did it because they saw people in need and couldn't walk away. They risked their own lives, took their small boats into dangerous waters, because it was the right thing to do. That's not technology or training. That's humanity, at its most basic and most beautiful. Even the nurses who opened those fatal portholes were acting out of compassion for their patients. They saw wounded soldiers struggling to breathe in the stuffy air of the ship's interior. And they did what any caring person would do. They opened the windows to let in fresh air. The tragedy isn't that they made a mistake. The tragedy is that their kindness was turned against them by circumstances beyond their control. But here's what I find remarkable. What gives me hope even in this story of disaster and death. Despite everything that went wrong, despite every system failure and human error and impossible circumstance, over 1,000 people survived that disaster. Compare that to the Titanic, where more than 1,500 people died. The improvements worked, even when everything else failed. The human spirit worked, even when the technology didn't. Captain Bartlett, Iceberg Charlie, the man who had learned caution from other people's disasters, managed to keep his ship afloat long enough for most of his people to escape. The crew, faced with impossible choices and deadly circumstances, still managed to launch enough lifeboats to save the vast majority of the people on board. The passengers, including wounded soldiers who couldn't even walk, helped each other survive. And that tells me something important about how we should face our own modern disasters. It's not about having perfect systems or flawless technology or foolproof plans. It's about maintaining our humanity when everything around us is falling apart. It's about making decisions based on compassion and courage rather than fear and panic. It's about helping each other, even when helping seems impossible, because the Britannic is still down there, waiting in the depths, holding on to its secrets and its lessons. The wreck of the HMHS Britannic sits on the floor of the Aegean Sea like a monument to human complexity. She's a testament to our incredible ability to learn from our mistakes, to build better and safer things, to turn tragedy into wisdom. The safety improvements that went into her construction did save lives. The lessons learned from the Titanic did make a difference. But she's also a reminder that we can't engineer our way out of being human. That compassion and courage and the desire to help can sometimes lead us into disaster, that even our best intentions, our most careful plans, our most advanced technology can be overwhelmed by the simple, brutal reality of an uncaring universe. Violet Jessup understood this. She went back to sea not because she thought she was invulnerable, but because she knew she wasn't. She kept working on ships not because she believed disasters couldn't happen, but because she had learned how to survive when they did. She chose to live her life fully aware of its fragility, and that awareness made her stronger, not weaker. The Britannic story isn't really about ships or mines or engineering failures. It's about the choice we all have to make when we face the unknown. Do we let fear make our decisions, or do we choose to keep going despite the risks? Do we retreat from life because terrible things might happen, or do we embrace life because terrible things will happen, and we might as well face them with courage? The ship is still down there, 400 feet below the surface, slowly being reclaimed by the sea. Divers still visit her, still explore her corridors, still find new artifacts and new stories. And every time they do, they're reminded that the past isn't really past. The choices that those people made in 1916, the courage they showed, and the mistakes they made are still relevant today because we're still making the same choices. We're still facing disasters that our technology can't prevent and our protocols can't solve. We're still choosing between safety and compassion, between helping others and protecting ourselves, between moving forward and staying safe. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Britannic. Not that we should build better ships or write better safety manuals, although those things matter, but that we should remember what it means to be human in the face of the impossible, to choose courage over fear, compassion over safety, hope over despair, even when the waves are rising and the ship is sinking and everything we thought we knew turns out to be wrong. What other untold maritime disasters do you think deserve to be remembered? Let me know in the comments below.